Good afternoon. I'm Jan Thomas, the Director of Kenyon's Office for Community Partnerships. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we celebrate Jamie Lyn Smith's new book, Township. Jamie Lyn has done so much to bring great writing programs and book discussions to Knox County, and Kenyon has been really pleased to be a partner on many of these. Today, we are especially excited to recognize Jamie Lyn for her own achievements as an author. So congratulations, Jamie Lyn, and on behalf of Kenyon and everyone here today, we look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Hello all, I'm John Chidister. I'm the director of the Public Library of Mount Vernon in Knox County. I've been in that position since shortly after the last dinosaur died. And it's my great privilege to consider myself a friend and colleague of both David Lynn and Jamie Lyn Smith Fletcher, and to actually be Jamie Lyn's boss currently. We are excited about her new book and very pleased that we have people coming today to find out about it. So David is a editor emeritus of the Kenyon Review, a position that he held for some 26 years, I think. He's also a very gifted author in his own right, award-winning. So he's won awards for both writing and editorial excellence. And he's always fun to listen to. And I've never been in his presence when I did not come away feeling enlightened and also delighted. Jamie Lyn, I can say a few things about her that no one else knows. One, that she was a friend of my son Brian when they were both in high school, even though they went to different high schools. So she's been a factor in my personal family life for a long time. So I'm happy to have everyone here. I hope we have a good crowd today. I'm not sure how many we actually have listening in, but you are all very welcome. And I would like to turn it over to Jamie Lyn now, and she can begin talking about her book, Township, and read a little bit from it.
Thanks, everybody, so much. I'm just really excited to read today and have all of you here joining us. And it's really exciting to do this work, particularly today in the company of so many people who have been intimately involved in it. David's been such a good friend and mentor. The first story in the collection, Nature Preserve, was the first story that I published, and it appeared in the Kenyon Review in, I think, 2016, 2015. And, you know, since then, I've been David's fellow in workshops, and he's just been a wonderful supporter and literary lifeline for so many people and so many writers in Knox County. And as John mentioned, I've been haunting the Public Library of Mount Vernon in Knox County since I was in about the first or second grade, I think. And so it's really wonderful to be working at a place that inspired me so much and that played an important role in me becoming a writer when I was growing up. And as I still continue to grow up. This is such an all Ohio book, and I'm really excited about that. The beautiful cover design is by Kara Eccles. Even the author photo is Erica Hardesty, another Kenyon grad. And it's really wonderful to work with Jan and with Kenyon College, my alma mater, you know, to be able to return something to a community that gave me so very much and that has informed my work and really been part of it. And before I forget, I also want to thank our absolutely fabulous interns, Fisher Wheeler and Janine Brooks, who are here supporting us today and supporting so many library events. Keep your eyes peeled. They'll be bringing you some great NEA Big Read programming. And with that, I'm going to stop shilling and start talking about the book. Now, Township is set in what I guess would be fair to call a fictionalized version of Knox County. It isn't necessarily one particular township. I think there's a little bit of every township in it in some ways, in one way or another. And one of the really neat things about writing this and about being a writer who writes about place, my favorite writer, Louise Erdrich, I have her quote on my wall, and she says, "Here I am where I ought to be. A writer must have a place where she feels this, a place to love and be irritated with." And I think that I don't so much feel the irritation all the time, but I do feel the love all the time. And perhaps somewhat like marriage, right? You choose someone, you absolutely love them, and you can drive them a little crazy and they can drive you a little crazy back. And the tension of that love that I have for this particular place has been really interesting to explore in this book, because I grew up here, I went to college here, and then I moved away for like 15 years. And so I spent a long time in New York and several years in Los Angeles. And so returning here and writing about this place, I sometimes feel like an insider and an outsider at the same time. And exploring that in these stories has been really enlightening and has been really fun, to be honest. The one I'm going to read today is called Search, Rescue, and Recovery. And I spent a lot of time along the Kokosing River when I was growing up and continue to spend time on it as an adult. If I'm missing in the summer, I'm probably in my kayak. So that's the best place to find me. Just start somewhere along the Kokosing Valley Water Trail, and there I will be. And this particular story, I think, has been mentioned as like one in which the dynamics between parents and children and the way that technology both expands and contracts our lives are some of the things that I was thinking about when I wrote it. So this is Search, Rescue, Recovery. That whole week brought havoc to Stowe Valley Camp and Canoe. A domestic dispute among tent campers drew the sheriff out twice on Monday. On Wednesday, a thunderstorm felled several trees and knocked out electric to a whole block of RV glampers. It was humid as hell and insufferable along the hiking trail due to the swollen, rotten carcass of a llama that wandered over from the neighboring farm and dropped dead in the woods. Thursday, my kids were goofing around with a nail gun, and we wound up taking a family trip to urgent care for tetanus booster shots and stitches. By Friday afternoon, we were so far behind on prep for Father's Day weekend that I left my son, Jacob, to run the camp store. Diana was helping me replace Edison outlets on the RV hookup stations, which is to say that she was handing me tools, listening to me cuss, and preparing to knock me off the ladder with a 2x4 if I got electrocuted. The hot sun beat down on us. I was hacking at molten plastic, ripping out miles of fried wire, and muttering that I should have had the foresight to pursue a career in accounting or insurance sales. Anything but following in my father's footsteps as the sole proprietor of a 4-star outdoor recreational facility. Diana touched my arm, jolting me from my complaint. Kenneth, she said, look. She pointed to a small crowd gathering around some kayakers at the put-in. When we got to the river, the man, Steve was his name, was bellowing that they could not find their boy. Steve had one of those dumb Navy tattoos, a mermaid whose breasts jiggled when he clenched and unclenched his fist. Marla, the mother, had a sweetness to her face that seemed to say please, and I was certain that she spent her days at a cash register, meaning it when she told people to have a good day. The girl with them was about 14. She kept pulling at a bunch of those silly bands bracelets on her wrist, nervous as a hare. Was their boy here? Had we seen him? Steve's eyes sunk deeper in his head when Diana shook her head no, twisting a strand of blonde hair that had fallen loose from her ponytail. God damn it, I can't take much more of his shit, Steve said. I looked at him. Devin, sometimes he runs off. Steve said that the boy had learning issues, that Devin wasn't quite right and was young for his age. While Steve rambled, Marla stared at her shoes. She wore a pair of soaking wet sneakers that made squeaking sounds when she shifted her weight, and I remember being distracted by the flatulating squelch. Devin's always rambling off and looking for something, Marla said, her voice trembling. He always comes back. We'll find him, I said. Don't worry. Diana called the sheriff while I radioed the volunteer fire department. My buddy Ross and his girlfriend organized a search of the grounds. Some tent campers bought bottles of water and snacks to the family while I hustled to hitch up the boat trailer. Dad, Jacob said. I looked up. I know that kid from school. Who is he again? I asked. He played t-ball with me that one year, Jacob said. Remember? Flaps his arms all the time and had to leave the team. Jacob held up his phone and showed Devin's picture. The boy's face was cherubic, naive. I remembered seeing him in the hallways after school, ducking his head low and letting his bangs fall over his face to avoid my hello. They call him Lockdown because he runs away all the time and then the whole school gets shut in. I better not hear you calling him that. I don't beast like that. Jacob sounded so hurt, and I realized too late that I should have known better than to start yet another argument. We had been at each other's throats all summer. The boy, formerly so eager to help with the canoe livery, retreated into his PSP, his phone, the computer, anything with pixels. It was infuriating for me to see my son thickening up, turning pale and chubby as a lump of bread dough from hours and hours, cruising imaginary cities in stolen cars, blasting away at the cops with a pretend AR-15. At Jacob's age, I was already running rescue with my dad and cutting all the firewood for the campground, chasing real girls instead of picking up digital hookers and dyeing weird colors in my hair. Diana made me lay off Jacob after he won a prize at some kind of gaming conference and started getting small sponsorships for his YouTube channel. But that victory and his burgeoning online fame with a following of 1,000 other nerdy game wonks just sucked Jacob deeper into the recesses of the worldwide waste of time and farther away from reality. Glitching, Dad, you're glitching, he said. What? I dropped the canoe I was loading and its plastic hull barked against the metal carrier. So can I go with? Can you be away from Call of Whoredom that long? You're on me no matter what I do. I felt a blush of shame creep up my neck. He was right. Jacob shuffled his feet and said, I rented them the boats this morning. I feel bad for Devin. He's kind of lost all the time. All right. I nodded. Sure, you can go. I understand. Yes, he said, pumping his fist and running up the hill. Yeah. Hug your mother, I said. She's real worried. He nodded, his blue tinted hair catching the sun as he sprinted away. Maybe this would be good for him. Lord knows Jacob could use a dose of reality. The family was waiting in front of the camp store when I pulled the van around. Jacob helped the women onto the bench seat, gesturing for Steve to sit up front by me. Steve cleared his throat. Thanks for helping us. How far are we going? I asked. He wiped his face with his shirt. I don't know, 3 or 4 miles upriver. This gave me pause. The family had paddled right past the village of Stowe. Why hadn't they called for help finding Devin then? I cleared my throat. Will you know where to put in if we drive along the road? I think so. Steve sounded hoarse, exhausted, and far from certain. I remember, Marla said. She leaned forward and kissed Steve's cheek so tenderly that I had to look away. Jacob was talking to Kylie. Both of them were pointing at something on his cell phone, their faces fixed in the 1,000-yard stare of the web addicted. Hey, Jacob, I said, did you check the straps on the kayaks? Yes, sir, we're game ready. I saw the girl smile a little tentatively, and as much as I wanted to jerk Jacob by the arm and tell him that this was no effing game, I could not bring myself to do it. At least he was talking to a human female in real life. That was progress. The 5 of us were near silent as we wound our way along the main road through Stowe's only stoplight. We passed the bar, the post office trailer, and the turnoff for the ashram. We passed a bunch of cars in the Watercraft Trail parking lot where a large cluster of families were picnicking down onto the banks under a huge, brightly colored Happy Juneteenth banner. The families had to have been there already when Steve and Marla paddled by looking for Devin. Finally, at Quarry Church Road, Steve tapped the glass and said, there, we was just down from there. Jacob radioed the sheriff while I put the van into the parking area, sandy soil whispering beneath our tires. Soon, the bank swarmed with EMTs in bright yellow vests, river rats in denim cutoffs with tennis shoes, and the photographer from the local paper. I nodded to Randy and Brian, the divers from the volunteer fire department. Both military trained, they were the best men we had. While Jacob and I geared up, Sheriff TC asked the family several questions. Was there a life vest in the kayak? Yes, but the boy didn't have it on. How long had Devin been missing? About 2 hours now, maybe a little more. Does he know how to swim? He swam good, Steve said, voice catching. I taught him. TC stayed ashore with Marla and Kylie while I helped Steve into our canoe. The rest of the boats were spread out around us, waiting. Steve nodded. We started to paddle. I tried to imitate TC's genial demeanor as I asked Steve questions. Was the fishing hole before or after the house with the pink porch? Did he happen to remember if he'd passed the old canal locks? Steve just shook his head and said, I'll know it when I see it. You better, I thought. You damn well better. Thank you. Thank you, David.
That was great, Jamie Lyn. So let me jump in here and congratulate you and and say how much I enjoyed that reading, how much I enjoy your work. I think this is an amazing book. And I urge those of you who weren't able to be with us today and buy it in person and get it signed to order it as soon as you can. I know a link was sent around, and I know that Jamie Lyn would be happy to sign this for you at some opportunity. One of the things I really love about it is that in the very front of the book, there's a hand-drawn map. And it's totally and entirely fictional, except that it's not. And there are names and places like Owl Creek, which I love, and Cleveland 100 and Columbus 60. And it's pretty great, but it emphasizes, I think, what Jamie Lyn was talking about in her remarks to begin about the importance of place here. And I'd like to push that a little farther, Jamie Lyn, because, you know, a lot of authors don't care much about place, but some of America's great authors, from Faulkner to you know, authors you've mentioned and all of that, place is very important. But I think it's hard to write about place. What kinds of challenges did you have in writing about a place you know so well, and yet treat it as fiction?
You know, I think one of the things that I struggled with is with these stories, for example, in Nature Preserve, I lived right by that deer dump. I lived right by that Nature Preserve. Everything else is fictional. You know, I like to use the place as a starting point, and then pretty much make up everything else. I mean, I feel like as a writer, there are always threads of things that we have either experienced or witnessed, you know,
And yet
come into contact with in our work. Yeah.
And yet the characters are so rooted to this place as well. It's as if they come right out of the soil and the 7-Elevens in this particular place.
And it might be more like, you know, the Dollar Generals should not be undersold here either. I mean, there are so many, right? Like it's become like a culture of itself, of its own. I think it is true that many of the characters have been inspired by real people, but I never want someone to read my book and think, oh my gosh, this writer stole my story. You know, there was a crime that was similar to a crime that's in the book. And again, I try to take that as like an inch of truth and create a yard of fiction out of it. But also too, you know, coming back to Ohio, and having sort of a foot in each world, again, where you're outside and inside at the same time, I think is what gave me the ability to see the place with fresh eyes and to use the access that I have as someone who's from here and, you know, couldn't be anything but from here in some ways, and use that as a jumping off point. The map, of course, is real similar to Knox County. I couldn't imagine it not being. And to think of Faulkner, who I started reading when I was about 9 or 10, because I grew up on this, like, it was a terrible, terrible mistake, but I grew up on this one lane dirt road. And like once or twice a week, my parents would take us to the library. So most of the time to entertain ourselves, we had books, we had television, but I would always read my library books way before we were scheduled to go back to the library. And I found, interestingly, my uncle's books from when he was at Kenyon. And so I just started reading them, and among them was this really baffling book called Sanctuary by William Faulkner. And I mean, I was in like 5th grade and I could read the words and I could look them up in the dictionary, but putting the meaning together is something that baffles, you know, like literary scholars to this day, right? And to some degree when it comes to Faulkner and his use of language. But I do think that what I took from reading those books when I, you know, of course I revisited them as an adult and as a student, but I think what I took from those books was that it was all right to write about places like this, that places like this can be just as interesting and compelling, and that you can build a whole world in your head. And that as long as you're able to get it on the page in a way that allows other people access to it, then you're doing your job as a writer. And so I think the difficult part for me, in fact, one of the things that I read today about when the when the sheriff is questioning the family, were there life jackets, right? Did he know how to swim? Interestingly, came from workshop, because, you know, we get blind to the spots of normalcy in our life, right? Like the things that we do all the time are the hardest to explain when you're from a particular place. And I remember in workshop with this particular story, I got in all sorts of trouble because the workshop leader said, the story doesn't make any sense. How did he drown with a life jacket on? And I started laughing because, like, we don't wear life jackets on the river. You sit on them in your kayak or your canoe. You're not required. I mean, I guess under a certain age you are now, but certainly when I was growing up, it wasn't like, and I rarely see that rule enforced, like when you have a certain level of comfort with the water, right? Or with farm equipment or with whatever, you know, it is that you're growing up around. And I remember thinking, like, you know, one of the challenges sometimes is translating things that the dominant culture would expect, right? Which is that if you put a child in a canoe and you send them, or kayak, and you send them off by themselves, they will have a life jacket on. And so it kind of was necessary to explain without explaining. And so that's been one of the challenges, right? Or explaining the way that the way that characters respond to one another because of longstanding family ties, you know, or a conflict over, what was it, a pig started the Hatfields and McCoys war that went on forever and ever. And, you know, it's not always a pig, right? But there's always something that explains these deep relationships.
Well, in these stories, whether it's drowning or other things, you deal with a lot of sad, disturbing, powerful, moving things, and yet it won't surprise anyone who knows you that the stories are also filled with humor. They're very funny. They're laugh out loud funny. How did you do that? How did you bring humor into the stories, and what role do you think it plays in mediating or dealing with the kind of really sad and powerful things your stories are about?
You know, I mean, I grew up in like relative poverty, and you know, we were often, my parents both worked, you know, really like low paying manual labor, working class jobs, and, you know, very much on the edge, like, and so a way of coping with that, right, is through laughter. And you have to find some kind of joy and hilarity in your life in order to survive your condition. And I think that the other thing I love about humor, that I think sometimes doesn't happen, especially when outsiders interview people here, or interview people who are living in rural America, or in situations or in cultures outside the dominant culture, right, is that laughter is a sign of intelligence. And so I want people to know that these characters may be poor, but they're smart and they're aware of the world, perhaps in a very different way. You know, I mean, I can't rebuild an engine, you know. I can break down a Sestina for you if you need help with that. But you know, that this is just a really different, a place that I took a lot of the difference that I now perceive for granted when I moved, when I left. And when I came back, I realized what a unique and interesting experience it had been, you know, growing up in this culture here. And so I think that if I told these stories without humor, they would just be unbearable, you know, and without acknowledging that you can have, that life is absurd and sometimes inexplicably so, and that you can be laughing in one breath and crying in the next, and that those things aren't exclusive. They can exist in the same moment. My other writing mentor, the wonderful Erin McGraw, who David also knows, talks about the best emotion in literature comes when you're blending those emotions, and when characters have to fight to figure out which of the 3 or 4 things that they're feeling they're going to act upon, right? And so that tension, I think, is where the humor comes in to my writing. And I also really love the way that rural people have a sense of humor about life. I mean, it's, you know, you can be as dignified and pastoral as you want, but if you're giving a tour of your barn and the cows breaking wind all over the place, like, you've got to laugh. I mean, it's just ridiculous if you're trying to, you know, deal with these everyday things. And I think that there's an expression in Appalachian culture about, in which we say, you know, don't get above your raisin, right? Like, don't outgrow the world that made you you. And I think the humor is also, for me, a very conscious assertion that this complexity can exist here in a way that we often see it done seamlessly and without question in locations and settings that are considered more sophisticated or high dollar.
As you were writing your stories, can you reflect back and tell us about a time or two that your story took over and kind of surprised you in ways that you didn't expect going into it?
Yes. I would say in Nature Preserve. I wrote that in the framework of the basic story in one sitting. And it just started with an encounter I had with the caretaker at the Nature Preserve. And I'd been thinking about the deer dump and all of this stuff. And then it just like the story just sort of, I don't want to say wrote itself, but it was there in a way that I have only experienced a few times in my writing. You know, it was still a lot of work to bring it to its final form. I think that too, with the newcomers, I really wasn't sure if I was going to let that couple get back together at the end or not. You know, and the dog came out of nowhere. I mean, I have a boxer that behaves really badly and is far too affectionate with my husband, but other than to his endless dismay, but other than that, you know, I think that allowing that to happen in your work is really important, and allowing there to be a sort of release lever, again, going back to that humor, right? Where you can be walking through some pretty terrible things. And if you don't allow your, as a writer, allow yourself to invite in things that you didn't anticipate, then you're not doing your job, which isn't telling, it's listening. I think of myself as a listener.
What are you working on now?
I'm actually really glad you asked. I'm finishing up my first novel. It's really my second novel, but the first one was terrible and I threw it away. So it's called Hometown. And the chapter that is Lifeguards is the first chapter in that book. So the characters, Jesse, Amanda, Tyler, and Seth, wind up encountering each other again about 20 years later, as adults, and some of them have moved away from Laurelton and come back. Some of them have stayed. Tyler is running for sheriff. He discovers that his son is transgender and assaults him. And they all come into contact because Amanda is working in social services, Jesse is a local minister, and Seth's an attorney. And so it's in part inspired by the high school I went to. It's never good when they make the national news, but there was an incident in which they, for a while, shook the tree and threatened to refuse federal funding if they had to provide bathroom accommodations to a transgender student. And, you know, I graduated from there a long time ago. I thought they were done pissing me off, and it turns out they weren't. So so that's where I had the book start, you know, with the way that I saw people behaving over that whole thing. And, you know, I never, I don't know if any of us can anticipate the times we'll be walking through in history. But I write for people who walk through it in a way that invites questioning, and then invites space for us to think about ways the world could be better. And so I'm excited about Hometown because it's really a story about for friends who, don't necessarily have their act together and whose lives are moving in really different directions. I've also been really concerned about the rise of, white nationalism and paramilitary groups in this area. And I've had my eye on them for a long time. And that group was involved and is well-funded and continues to assert itself in ways in our community that I would probably continue to fight for the rest of my life. So it's great to be able to explore these themes through storytelling, and also look at like, how does someone go from kind of being like maybe a little out there to getting involved with an extremist group like that? Like, what is that journey? Because this is still a person, and I don't at all mean to imply that I sympathize with the point of view, but I think that rendering this in a book that articulates the way that people can take those sort of hard turns in life, and the choices that we're confronting in rural America as the world changes and as our population changes and as our expectations of gender change, is an exciting project to be working on. So. Yeah.
Well, that's great, Jamie Lyn. Thank you for this. Congratulations. I'm really excited about this book. I'm eager to see the novel when it comes out, and I want to see more of your work going forward.
Thanks so much, David. And I think we're moving into Q&A with my boss, John Chidister.
I apologize. Momentarily, while you were reading, Jamie Lyn, I apparently lost my Wi-Fi connection, or something went really haywire with my either my device or my connection, and so I missed part of that, and I'm really sorry about that. I was worried that maybe something else was going wrong, but I think I'm good. Okay.
I'm glad you're back.
Thank you both so much for that very enlightening and enjoyable exchange, and it's time to open it up to questions and answers for the entire audience. I apologize that I sort of neglected early on in my earliest remarks to mention that people could be typing in questions for Jamie Lyn at any point, and we would take them one at a time. Janine is going to be curating those for us. And so I'm going to ask Janine, are there any questions that have been typed in to the chat? I couldn't see the chat myself. Sorry.
There are no questions so far, but we do have some congratulations from Rebecca. So thank you for the congrats.
Thank you, Becky.
So while we're waiting for people to type some questions in, and I hope you're all considering and starting to type right now, I'm going to ask a question of my own, if I may. The second story in your collection, deprivation of body, generosity of spirit, struck me as this phrase came into my head at some point while I was reading it. Esalen meets Knox County, and it struck me as not the entire story, but portions of it had a more California-ish feeling to them than almost anything else in the book. And I found myself wondering, what if you can just tell us a little about the genesis of this story, how it developed in your own mind, and where it sort of comes from.
Sure. So I have like a really weird cross section of friends. They all kind of do a little bit of everything, and you're introduced to new worlds through your friends. And so one of the themes among my friends is people becoming yoga teachers or getting into these. I have like 10 friends who are yoga teachers, which would have been unimaginable 20 years ago, right? When we were graduating college. And so I've always found it really fun to sort of like unpack the interplay between this sort of like pathological, like uber wellness stuff that can kind of, honestly, it can grate on my nerves a little bit, but so also can the refusal to like acknowledge the beauty and wonder of nature. So it's a really weird line, right, between the two. And that was tension that I wanted to explore in the way that these two friends who have known each other for a long time, the way that their paths sort of take them in different directions, and they have to decide if they're going to continue to be friends or not, and so that was part of it. And I think that like there are, I mean, there's a thriving wellness community here. We've got how many yoga studios here in town and all of this stuff that I think if you had told me in 1992, when I graduated from high school, I would have laughed so hard if I thought I would be able to go do hot yoga twice a week or as many times a week as you can manage, right? Or that we would have, I don't know, isn't there a CBD shop now? Like we've got all sorts of wild stuff happening here. And one of the things I love about Knox County, is when I worked in a social services organization, the expression that one of our board members had was, if they made it, we got it. You know, there's a little bit of everything here. And I like the way that I think it's always fascinating, the way that there are these subcultures anywhere that you live, you know, and people that are off doing something that it maybe never would have crossed your mind. Apparently, Ohio is quite the home to like high-end heirloom chicken breeders, and there's a chicken show here every year that's just like this huge event. I mean, we have not one but now 2 Bigfoot conferences. Like, I mean, I don't have to make things up in this book. Like, things just happen. And so I'm going to get tickets and there will be a story. But like, you know, with this particular piece, I thought a lot about, you know, I was at a time in my life when I wrote it, and I guess I'm still at that point in middle age where like, you're kind of seeing where people are winding up. And if people are going to take a turn one way or another, you know, they're taking it, they're making career changes, or they're finally at a point where they can start a business or do something. And then 2, there are the changes like the big breakup, right? Lots of my friends are well through their first divorces, or, you know, if you marry young and, you know, it doesn't work out, this is kind of like the time in your life when those things start happening. So that is really a story, as much as it's also about like shrooms and love and heartbreak. It's also at its core about change and how much people will let you change, and if you'll allow the people who have been in your life a long time to change with you. So that's where the story came from. I never got the California vibe before, though. That's fascinating. It must have been accidental.
Yeah, having a long time ago watched the movie Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, that kind of came through for me.
I'll have to rewatch that.
I perceive that we have had a few questions and remarks come in now. I can't read them, but they flash across the bottom of my screen as they come in. Too fast for me to actually read, but Janine, if you would like to read the first question or two, and Jamie Lyn can answer.
So I'm gonna try to read these in order. The first one comes from Bentley. It says, this expands on John's questions. You are one of the most authentic voices I know. I wonder how sharper you feel your perception of Knox County is because of your time you spent on the coast away from it.
I still tried to get away from it. There's only so much vacation you have, right? Like, or so much time you can spend away. But I think that it's always, I definitely feel of 2 worlds in some way, you know. At heart, I think that if I had to scatter my ashes, I would probably divide them in half, right? Not to be totally morbid. I'm hopefully a long way away from needing to do something like that. But I think that half of them would certainly need to go in the East River. And the other half would go in the Kokosing, is the way I would see it unfolding. And that's definitely being of 2 hearts, right? You can love 2 places just as much at the same time. New York, living there, you know, it was a whole other life, right? Like, I did a lot of theater work, which was really, really wonderful and informed so much of the way that I write dialogue and so much of the way that I craft story. And it's also the reason that I reread Aristotle twice a year, at least, sometimes 3 times. I can't help myself. So if you want to be a writer, study the poetics and read everything. But with the coast, talk about an insider-outsider feeling, right? Like, perhaps I'm never quite at home in either place. And if I'm one place, sometimes I'm longing for another. Sometimes I'm perfectly content there. So I think that being comfortable with that duality and that tension is something that as a writer, I'm not unfamiliar with, and that I'm always struggling to convey in the work. I may write a book about LA. I may write a book about New York someday, but right now, I think Township came about because I was writing short stories and grappling with what I was going to do now that I was back here and intending to stay and making a life and a place for myself here. So there are other things that I want to explore in other writing, but I don't think that it makes it less authentic if I don't necessarily live in California by the time I write that book. It doesn't make it any less authentic if I write about, I don't know, avant-garde theater in New York in the 90s and early aughts. If I write about it later, you know, and for me, I think it takes a lot of processing time for me to really think through what the story is and to tell the truth. And telling the truth is where authenticity comes from. So I just try to tell the truth. It's easier to remember anyway.
We have a question from Robert that asks if you could talk more about the paramilitary groups in the area.
Oh, I don't really want to, but what I would say is, I mean, if you are keeping an eye on things and watching what's happening, I think it's fairly clear that, you know, there is also from the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can look at what is unfortunately but accurately called a hate map. And I think that in the North, we tend to think of these things as being consolidated in the South. And it shows very clearly when you look at these red dots, there is a cluster in this area. There are clusters in Idaho. There are clusters in New York State, right? Like we're not alone or specific. But I think that in the last 5 years, we've certainly heard those voices empowered by the highest reaches of office, and seen those things coming to exist in the light that used to exist in the shadows. So I think that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and it's important to call a wolf a wolf. So I write about it.
Okay, we have a question from Rebecca that says, how do you manage your time for writing? Do you set aside a regular time every day or week, or do you just write when you feel inspired?
Not this month. I've been really busy with with this book coming out, so I haven't written as much as I would like. But in general, I write in the morning. And I try to do that before I take on any administrative work. I usually get up early and set aside that time. I found that once I do one single administrative task, my creativity kind of goes out the window for the day. I may, after work, be able to like read through a draft and mark it up so that I can go back and edit it. But I find that, you know, it's really the opposite. When I was much younger, I did all of my writing late at night. And now I will get up at dawn and work for a couple of hours in the morning and then go about the rest of my day. And I have to be really protective of that time, right? Because I have a full-time job. And of course, you know, I have a dog who's very demanding. We're just her butler. I've got my husband who I want to spend time with and, you know, like not be on the computer every single waking second. So carving out that time is important. I've also learned to like really make that time count. You know, if I have 8 hours, I will get a lot less done than if I have 2. And it's just whatever is going on in my brain. You know, if I have a lot of time, I don't necessarily use it as efficiently. So I found it works better for me to set aside that time and work at the early part of the day. I'll write a little bit more on the weekends, and I take Sundays off. I always try to have there be a day off. I mean, look, even God rested. So like you need to take a break and give your mind time to refresh. One of the things that I really wish I had understood the value of when I was little was growing up way out in the country with no cable, hardly any neighbors, and tons of time to read and just ride my bike or hike around the woods or whatever. Contemplative time is the most important thing for me as a writer. It's not necessarily sitting at the desk that I get all of my work done. I get a lot of work done when I'm pulling weeds in the garden or walking the dog or going for a jog. And I don't like to stare at a blank screen or, sit and kind of like wait for inspiration to come. But I think that showing up every day and doing that work has been a really important part of my practice.
Doug asks, you read about local culture you grew up in. Have you ever experienced outsiders disrespecting local culture? If so, how?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I've seen insiders disrespecting local culture, right? Like it's it's not like, and also who's an insider and who is an outsider, right? I think it's, another world that I straddle, if you will, like where I have a foot in each side, is between the college and town, right, if you will. And I think that even when I was a student, it was interesting because if someone didn't know that I was local, they might say something that was it was really rude, even if they didn't mean it, and it was coming from a place of ignorance. And so I would often interpret and I would be like, okay, look, this is the way, it's this way, right? And I knew then that was something, even then, that was something special, right? Having the opportunity to say like, no, wait, look, and I wish that sometimes, as my world has grown and broadened and I've encountered people whose lives are entirely unlike mine. And I wish that we all had interpreters like that. Wouldn't it be great to help us understand the way that something is unfurling or that we've committed some sort of, transgression of manners. It would be nice if we had interpreters all the way through. So rather than, I wish that human beings could all just pop out of the womb and we totally understood each other. But then of course there'd be no conflict and I wouldn't have a job because, happy doesn't make great stories. It's kind of boring, which is why there's always drama in a novella or a soap opera. But language, and the reason I love working with it, is that it gives us so many opportunities to it's how we understand each other. And it's all about understanding. You understanding me understanding you, us understanding the world. So being able to tell these stories, I hope, helps people maybe understand one experience here. There's certainly, this is not representative. I'm not trying to be J.D. Vance for like so many reasons, but this is a book that I wrote about things I've experienced and loosely based on things I've written and I've experienced here and things I may have lived here. But I'm not the only one. I mean, anybody in this webinar could write a book of stories that was loosely based on where they're from and their experience, and it would be just as valid. I hope that by writing this way, that more young writers will have the opportunity to realize the value of their own experiences and get it on the page so that we can enjoy it.
Jess asks Jess says that you've spoken a bit about how Mount Vernon partly inspired Township. In writing the novel, how did you explore your relationship with or to Mount Vernon? And how did that relationship change while writing Township?
If I'm honest, I think I absolutely love this place. I work here. I've dedicated my life to trying to do good stuff here, and trying to make life better for everybody here, and to the capacity that I can, through working in nonprofits and through my teaching, and of course through the work at the library. And so I would not necessarily say that it changed. As much as I definitely sometimes make fun of things, I think everybody who's from any place makes fun of it sometimes, right? Like that's part of the familiarity, the way you tease your cousin, or the way that your relatives and friends, make fun of you and your foibles and habits and oddities. Like that's a natural way of kind of like showing love for it. So I will say that even dealing with all of the heavy things that this book grapples with, it was a lot of there's a lot of love behind it, and a lot of really deep respect for people who spend their whole lives in one place. I've had a lot of opportunities to travel and worked all over the country and had a lot of different experiences, and that's been fantastic. But that doesn't mean that someone who grew up here, you know, stayed here the whole time, their experience is just as valid and can be far richer in ways than my own, right? It's just different. So thinking about how I view Knox County, I think I definitely want to be clear-eyed, but I want to be clear-eyed with like respect and love for the place I'm writing about, or I wouldn't spend all this time. I wouldn't spend all this time on it.
Brian says, in Nature Preserve, one of the two trustees, Ross, is initially more empathetic to Billy, but at the end, Cecile, I apologize, senses Billy's grief over the death of the fawn and reaches out to him, while Ross becomes intensely angry and unforgiving over Billy's actions. Can you talk about Cecile's transformation? Is it a case of someone who's growing as his interaction with Billy evolves?
You know, that character was kind of like, I didn't really want to write him because I was afraid that he would too easily go into stereotype of like a grumpy, angry guy, right? And I think that what happens with Cecile is that he learns that we can be different things to each other at different times, you know, and he has felt up to that point that what Billy needed was maybe to be shown how to be a man, or shown how to be a grown-up, or taught responsibility, or even sometimes taught a lesson. But at the end of the story, what he realizes is that they can't both go after Billy at the same time. That Billy, despite what he has done, and I'm trying not to do any spoilers here, despite what Billy has done, he still is a young person who needs that empathy and mercy. And so what I really liked about Cecile was that he gives it.
Robert asks, Shirley Jackson is my favorite writer. Do you know her?
I love her. No, I don't know her. Like, not personally, but I absolutely enjoy her work.
Okay,
I think
Rebecca.
we have time for like one more, Janine.
That's perfect, because we actually have one more.
Oh, wow.
Rebecca asks, what other themes, I'm so sorry, do you want to explore in future books?
I think a lot of, one of the reasons I became a writer is because I was really, really close with my grandfather, and he was just a magnificent storyteller, like legendary. And we would go to like a museum or the fair or anywhere, even like a diner. And by the time we left, there'd be like 15 people standing around listening to him tell these hilarious stories. And I learned so much about storytelling from him. I've always wanted to write about my family's experiences, particularly his life, and I haven't quite gotten to it yet. But, you know, they were like middle-class people, lost everything in the Great Depression, wound up being migrant farm workers. He was drafted into World War II, went around the world in the army, and like really, you know, had just an incredible experience in 20th century America. I haven't quite figured out how to write that, you know. I write some nonfiction, but that's not really, I usually write shorter pieces. And so I haven't really decided if I want to try to fictionalize that in some way, or if I want to do my inch of truth, yard of fiction. And again, this is something that like, I love long sweeping stories about families. I mean, I just read The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Flanon Jeffers, and it's incredible. And if I could do that, I would die happy. I recommend it for everyone. So, you know, I would love maybe at some point to kind of figure out what that sweeping intergenerational drama novel, historical novel would be. So I may do something like that. And the great thing about writing is you can change your mind, or you can let a project change and you can roll with it. So we'll have to see. But yeah, I would love to find a way to tell his story as I understand it, in a way that would kind of like bring some of the light that he brought back into the world. So
Jamie Lyn,
maybe, yeah,
I didn't know if my voice would come through or not.
it
We
does.
have sort of exceeded the time frame we had originally envisioned for programs. I think, although I believe there might be a few questions that didn't get addressed, but I think we've more or less run out of time here.
Sure.
I would like to say thank you to everyone involved here: Jamie Lyn, David Lynn, Janine and Fisher, and Jan Thomas in the Office for Community Partnerships. Thank you all for putting this together, making it happen. This was a great way to spend an hour on a Saturday afternoon for me. I loved it. I hope everyone else had as much fun as I did. I'm sure they probably did. And I think there's the chat transcript you'll have. So if there were unaddressed questions, you might be able to respond to the persons who asked those questions that didn't get addressed during the course of our presentation. I hope. But thank you all for attending. And I guess we are, everybody's ready to click off, right?
Thanks for coming, everybody, and for all of these great questions. Thank you, David, Jan, Fisher, Janine, and John, and everybody for joining us. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.